Let's talk about how F-16s will change the fight for Ukraine's independence. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. It is vital for us to remember that F-16s have been in production for nearly a half-century, and not all of them are created equal. But one thing is for sure, regardless of the type of F-16, it will be a marked improvement over Ukraine's existing fighter fleets, which are composed of Soviet-era MiG-29s and Su-27s, which themselves look pretty similar to those operated by their Russian opponents, but often carry even older avionics and other equipment, really limiting their performance. I'm going to quote Yuri Inat, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Armed Forces. A Russian jet can see 2 to 3 times further with its radar than our fighter. Our fighter is simply blind. It cannot see. When you hear that, it's pretty easy to assess that the F-16s Ukraine will be receiving will offer a pretty significant increase in capability, even if they are largely carrying systems that first emerged in the 1990s. The single-seat F-16AMs and two-seat F-16BMs being provided to Ukraine are indeed pretty dated. They received a midlife update in the early 2000s that brought them up on par, more or less, with the Block 50 or 52 F-16s that the US operated during Desert Storm. That is to say that it's up to Ukraine to figure out how to leverage these aircraft in the most effective way. As General Breedlove explained, if Ukrainians aren't well-versed in the proper tactics to leverage these more advanced fighters, quote, you're not going to realize any of the benefits of having a real 4+ generation aircraft. If you take an F-16 and fly it and use it like a MiG-29, you're just going to have a hot rod MiG-29, and that's it. A common Western error is to assume that Russia has failed to secure air dominance over Ukraine because it lacks the fighter capacity to do so. For these purposes, it's important to understand that their doctrine is very different from the Western or American way of war that we've come to recognize as effective in recent decades. The United States prizes air superiority as the means to improve the circumstances of all subsequent combat operations, but Russia, on the other hand, has established its warfare doctrine with NATO in mind. That is to say that Russian planners made the fairly astute assumption that they would probably not be able to secure air superiority in a large-scale fight, and as such, air power is not seen as a power unto itself in Russia, but rather as a sort of long-range extension of Russia's focus on securing what they call fire superiority. In other words, if Russia believed it could dominate airspace in a large-scale fight, its doctrine would reflect that. But because Russian planners know that they likely can't, they've adjusted their planning to suit. This isn't an example of Russia just choosing a different approach to warfare, so much as an example of mitigating its own strategic and tactical shortcomings. Russia has also struggled with pilot shortages, as we've discussed in depth in the past, forcing them to take instructors out of their training environments and thrusting them into frontline combat, which again further limits both the volume and efficacy of their fighter sorties now and in the future. Now, concerns about these pilot shortages and sanctions stifling aircraft production have left Russia pretty conservative in its use of air power to date, often keeping its aircraft inside Russian airspace while launching long-range weapons into Ukraine. F-16s carrying AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles will certainly make that a far more difficult proposition. Today, Ukrainian pilots currently rely on Soviet-era R-73 radar-guided missiles and both radar and infrared-guided iterations of the R-27, all of which fall well short of 30 miles or more of the AMRAAM's publicly disclosed range. But even with that in mind, Ukrainian F-16 pilots will still almost certainly be fighting an uphill battle against superior numbers, making it not necessarily a question of who would win between an F-16 and an Su-27, but rather it may often be who would win between an F-16 and 2 Su-27s. In particular, by unlocking new modes and new capabilities for the AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missile, or HARM, that Ukrainian forces have been leveraging since at least August of last year. Anti-radiation missiles like the AGM-88 work by honing in on the electromagnetic radiation broadcast by radar arrays. In other words, they're radar waves. Now this makes them uniquely suited for the suppression or destruction of enemy air defense job. Now because Ukraine's Soviet-era fighters were never meant to leverage the HARM missile, they have to use it in only one of its three existing modes. That one mode is usually called pre-briefed mode. In effect, the missile is pre-programmed with a target area, and then launched by an aircraft, often at pretty long distance. The missile flies towards its intended target area, using its seeker to look for any air defense systems that power up and start broadcasting radar waves for it to then close with and destroy them. Now, to be clear, this method can be very effective, especially when you launch these missiles in large volume, because even if they don't ultimately destroy an enemy radar site, their presence alone often makes enemy air defense crews power down their arrays. Now, this is the suppression of air defenses, as these powered down arrays allow aircraft to operate inside a contested area for a short time. But once the HARM threat has passed, these arrays can power back up and begin hunting for Ukrainian jets all over again. But when carried by aircraft with NATO standard buses for full connectivity, pilots can leverage these weapons' full capability set, including two more operational modes that can be really handy in a fight. These modes are called Self-Protect and Target of Opportunity. In Self-Protect mode, the aircraft's onboard radar warning receiver identifies an enemy radar array that's broadcasting, and then passes that target data over to the HARM missile, which can either hone in on the broadcasting radar or on the specific location that waves were coming from in the event the enemy powers the array down. The Target of Opportunity mode is similar, but leverages the AGM-88's onboard seeker to spot enemy radar arrays powering up, which then alert the pilot to launch the weapon, and that can be particularly handy in an aircraft without an onboard radar warning receiver. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Now, these additional modes will provide Ukrainian F-16 pilots with more options when flying the suppression or destruction of enemy air defense mission, basically allowing for a larger emphasis on destruction of these assets rather than just their suppression. And because these midlife update F-16s are equipped with the AN/ALR-69A radar warning receiver, they'll be much better suited to avoid incoming missiles than Ukraine's current jets. And let's take a minute to talk a little more about the value of that AN/ALR-69 radar warning receiver. You'll often see that written as RWR. Now, all of the F-16s coming from Denmark and the Netherlands received this system as part of their midlife update, but there have been subsequent maintainability and reliability modifications that it's tough to say whether or not they have. Nonetheless, regardless of which iteration of the ALR-69 they've got, it'll all be a big improvement over what they're operating today. The ALR-69A not only detects inbound threats, it provides the pilot with a great deal of situational awareness by showing a graphic representation of the type of threat radar that's currently painting or detecting their aircraft in the heads-up display. By using an onboard database of radar frequencies, it recognizes and discerns between not only friendly and enemy radar arrays, but even between the types of arrays leveraged by different weapon systems, providing the pilot with both an audible warning immediately upon being targeted, but also an indicator of the type of weapon that they've been targeted by. This would be a boon for Ukraine when leveraging the F-16 for air-to-ground or attack operations, which are currently conducted in large part by Su-25s that have no radar warning receiver on board at all. I'm going to quote one Ukrainian Su-25 pilot who is identified only by his call sign, Pumbaa. "Our jets don't have a system to warn about Russian rocket launches. It's all visual based. If you see them, then you just try to escape by firing off heat traps and maneuvering." Now, not only will these new to Ukraine F-16s be equipped with a better radar receiver, they also come with the Pylon integrated dispenser station to deploy chaff to disorient inbound radar guided missiles, as well as the advanced miniature jamming system, or AN/ALQ-10, which itself broadcasts radar signals back at the weapon to confuse it during its approach. Now, these systems combined with that ALR-69 radar warning receiver will almost certainly improve the Ukrainian fighters' survivability against these kinds of attacks. Russia claims the Irbis-E has a detection range that goes out to 400 kilometers, again, just shy of 250 miles, while the AN/APG-68 is said to have a detection range of 296 kilometers, meaning Su-35s will likely be able to spot the F-16 before the F-16 can spot it. But there is a big problem with these sort of on-paper comparisons. It's that they're built upon claims made by the Russian government and its primary defense contractors, all of whom have been guilty of exaggerating the capability of all sorts of Russian military hardware over the years.